what may be a huge fumble by the Trump administration, a contentious phone call between the president and the Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, one of America's closest allies. The president reportedly hanging up less than halfway through that phone call. Let's discuss now. Greg Miller is a national security correspondent of the Washington Post. He broke this story. Greg, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us on this busy evening here. You have this new reporting tonight on that call between the president and the Prime Minister of Australia that quickly went sour. What can you tell us?
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody that we talked to just characterized this call as really hostile, ended very abruptly. That it was a combination. Trump was badgering the Australian Prime Minister, was complaining about a deal regarding America's agreement to take some refugees that are being held in an Australian detention camp. But he also used the call to try to brag about his electoral college win and to call attention to his success in the election in November. And then when the Australian Prime Minister tried to move on to other subjects, including Syria, Trump abruptly sort of ended the call. He wanted to get off this call. Told the Australian Prime Minister, I talked to a lot of other foreign leaders today, including Vladimir Putin. This is the worst call of the day.
And this disagreement over refugees, right? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, so this was over an agreement that the Obama administration had reached to try to help Australia deal with a refugee crisis. Australia is holding roughly 2,500 refugees in these detention sites on islands off of Australia's coast, and it's become a huge humanitarian issue. And the Obama administration agreed to take half of them in a deal brokered by the United Nations. Trump did not like being forced to abide by that agreement, especially at a moment when he was trying to call attention to the executive order that he signed last week that places new restrictions on refugees, including from Muslim-majority countries.
Yeah, and, to compare it to a call to Vladimir Putin, this is one of our closest allies.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what makes it really remarkable, I think, is that it's hard to think of an American ally who has been more steadfast, more reliable than Australia. Obviously, Trump has had his issues with Mexico and other countries, but Australia has been there for the United States in the wars in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, diplomatically, through intelligence sharing, through counterterrorism missions. And so to have a blow-up with the Australian Prime Minister in his very first call as Commander-in-Chief is quite significant.
All right. Greg Miller of the Washington Post. Greg, thank you very much.
This is all coming from that series of phone calls that the president had last week. On Saturday, if you'll remember, he had 5 phone calls with foreign leaders, but it is the Australian phone call with the Australian Prime Minister that is really raising serious questions about the long-standing relationship the U.S. has with Australia. Now, we are told that this conversation ended abruptly, very abruptly, all over refugees. The president repeatedly was questioning what the Obama administration had done in terms of allowing some refugees to come to the U.S. here. Now, the readout of this call from the White House was totally different. Take a look at this readout. It says President Donald Trump and Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull spoke by phone for 25 minutes today. Both leaders emphasized the enduring strength and closeness of the relationship. Well, it turns out that is not at all how that phone call went. It was scheduled to last an hour. It actually ended abruptly. All this is happening, of course, as the Mexican relationship also in new controversy as well this morning because of an excerpt released from that phone call on Friday with a Mexican leader. Take a look at this. This excerpt provided to us says this. This is what the president said to the Mexican president. You may have some pretty tough hombres in Mexico that you may need help with. We're willing to help with that big league, but they have to be knocked out, and you have not done a good job knocking them out. So that set off firestorm in that conversation as well. So Chris and Allison, this is something that the White House is going to be answering questions about today. Again, they did not want to be talking about this, but this diplomacy is worrying so many permanent members of the White House National Security Council and others, just these relationships the U.S. has. And these are our allies we are talking about, not our foes. Chris.
Thank you for joining us. Let's talk about that phone call now, because the Prime Minister of Australia today was asked about this call. Let's listen.
I've seen that report, and I'm not going to comment on the conversation other than to say that in the course of the conversation, as you know, and as was confirmed by the President's official spokesman in the White House, the President assured me that he would continue with, honour the agreement we entered into with the Obama administration with respect to refugee resettlement.
Was President Trump upset with parts of the conversation?
Look, thanks for your inquiry, but I'm not going to comment on these reports out of the United States about the conversation.
But not the details, Prime Minister, but I think the Australian public would be interested in your relationship with our most important partner. Did he hang up the phone to you earlier than you expected?
Look, I'm not going to comment on these reports of a conversation. Australians know me very well. I always stand up for Australia in every forum.
Okay, Sarah Murray, you're in Australia. What's the reaction? Sarah Martin, you're in Australia. What was the reaction?
Look, it's been a fairly extraordinary story, and the reaction here, I think, has been one of shock and disbelief. I think not only the fact that the details of this high-level conversation have been leaked to the press in the US, which is obviously extraordinary in itself, but of course the details of this conversation and the fact that there does seem to have been quite a hostile exchange between the two leaders. Of course, this all comes in the context of Australia wanting to ensure that this deal with the Obama administration sticks. The Prime Minister has sought to be as diplomatic as he can be since the conversation on Sunday morning our time, basically refusing to comment on the United States executive order on immigration, taking a diplomatic line there because, of course, as we are learning today, it sounds as though this agreement to take refugees from Australia's offshore detention centres is really hanging by a thread. So I think today everyone has just been astounded at the details that have been leaked, and also I guess the sense of chaos and confusion that it seems to suggest, and particularly given we've had mixed reports about whether this deal is on or off or back on again. So it has been a day of confusion and disbelief.
President Trump clashing with the Australian Prime Minister over an agreement on refugees. What's been the reaction in Australia? CNN's Anna Corin is live from Sydney. Anna, what's happening there?
Well, Alison, it's certainly been met with shock and dismay that President Trump could publicly humiliate Australia's Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, and really trash an alliance that dates back to World War II. America and Australia share a very close relationship, but that seems to matter little to America's new president. Now, as far as the Prime Minister here was concerned, this deal was done. It was a deal that was signed with President Obama days before the US election in November, where America was willing to accept 1,250 refugees who are in offshore detention centres in PNG's Manus Island and the Pacific Islands, Nauru. These are people living in appalling conditions who are not allowed into Australia because they are boat people. They've come here by boat and are refused entry. It's part of Australia's hardline immigration policy. But we are now learning that Trump has not signed off on this deal, and that occurred from his tweet that we learned of. And I'll just read that tweet to you. It says, "Do you believe it? Administration agreed to take thousands of illegal immigrants from Australia. Why? I will study this dumb deal." So as I say, shock and dismay that the President of the United States has reacted this way to what was thought to be a done deal.
All right, Anna, thank you for bringing us that from Australia. So let's get reaction now from someone well-versed in international diplomacy. Tony Blinken was President Obama's former Deputy Secretary of State and former Deputy National Security Advisor. Good morning, Tony.
Hey, Allison.
Let's talk about Australia to begin with. So President Trump does not like this deal that President Obama had hatched with Australia over taking in 1,250 refugees who are currently languishing on an island off of Australia's coast. He doesn't like it. He thinks that it somehow would make the U.S. more dangerous. Now what?
Well, first, Allison, you know, we have enough challenges around the world that we probably shouldn't be picking fights with our closest friends, and Australia is among our closest friends. Australian soldiers fighting side by side with our own around the world for decades. This deal was important to Prime Minister Turnbull. It helped solve a problem that he's had on his hands. That is about 1,200 refugees living in deplorable conditions on islands just outside of Australia. We made a commitment to help out, And the important thing here is these are refugees. They're not immigrants, as the president suggested. That means that the process to bring them into the United States is going to take a long time. They'll be very, very carefully vetted. And we're talking mostly about women and children and folks who are fleeing terrorism, fleeing violence in the Middle East.
But given the phobias in the United States and given his mandate, the president is allowed to not like the deal. The question becomes, well, how does he go about expressing that, and what does that mean? How big a deal is it if you have a tough conversation with an ally early on?
Well, you know, first, we've seen a series of apparently tough conversations with the Mexicans about building the wall, now with the Australians about this refugee deal, with partners around the world who were deeply concerned about the refugee ban order. And so we seem to be getting into scrapes with friends and partners pretty much on every continent. And again, given the challenges that we face, given the threats that we have around the world, picking fights with our friends is not necessarily a good way to start.